All right, so this video is going to be about the skull bones, but now on an articulated skull. And I've specifically selected this one, which is the endocranial skull base anatomy, because, as you can see, if I just pivot him, the calvarium or skull cap has been removed, so we can see down into the brain pan and look at all the fun features that you can see interiorly, including things like the olfactory foramina of the ethmoid bone, some of the sphenoid features, etc. So we'll get to those in a minute. But first, let's just orient ourselves, shall we? And so I'm going to just use my pen and start labeling some things. I think I'll use pink today. That sounds nice. Okay, so let's start with a nice easy one, which is the frontal bone. So we're going to do bones first, and then I'll switch colors and do some bony features from this aspect, and then we'll just kind of twirl the skull around and do the same thing for the rest of the way around. So these little guys, there's two of them. Nasal bones times two. And here, there's also two of these, but I'm not going to label every single one. You should understand that there's bilateral symmetry to the skull, and therefore what's on one side is overwhelmingly also on the other. So this is the maxilla. That's the portion that contains your upper teeth. Making up the cheekbone is the zygomatic bone. The lower jawbone is the mandible. And you can see here kind of oblique view, so we'll turn the skull around so you can see the rest of it is the temporal bone. And then at the bottom, making up the bottom portion of the nasal septum, is the vomer. At the top is a piece of the ethmoid bone. And so for that, after I label this bottom curvy guy, which is the, can't write the letter R today, inferior nasal concha. Now I'm going to switch colors and just illustrate some features. So not bones, but parts of bones. So I mentioned the ethmoid bone and said that I was pointing to just one part of it, and that part is, parentheses, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So you can see the rest of the ethmoid bone from a different view, but from this view, you can just see the perpendicular plate. So on the frontal bone, we have a supraorbital foramen. So supraorbital means above the orbit. Speaking of that, the orbit is the eye socket. Now on the maxilla, below the orbit, we have the infra orbital foramen. So there's one on the top, one on the bottom. Friendly reminder about the supraorbital foramina, so here's another one, is that sometimes they're completely enclosed by bone on all sides, and that makes them a foramen. Sometimes they're just a notch, where the bone doesn't go all the way around, and it's just a little notch in the frontal bone instead of a hole. So just FYI, there's some slight possibilities for a different appearance for that particular feature. Okay, and then for my students, that's all we need to know on the front of the face. So let's go ahead and rotate. And we'll just look at some features of the side. So here we can see a better view of the temporal bone. And zygomatic bone. And we can also see, and I'm going to pick a skinnier color to do this because a skinnier dot. So just on the medial surface of the orbit on each side, behind the nasal bone, below the frontal bone, is the lacrimal bone. So the word lacry, that root, means tears, so it's related to crying. And the reason the lacrimal bone is called that is because it contains a groove and a hole, which is right about here. I can rotate it so you can see it a little better in a moment. But that little groove and hole contain a duct and a sac that basically collect tears after they've washed across your eyeballs and then dumps them into the nasal cavity. So this is why if you're crying, you get a runny nose because there's lots more fluid going through that little hole and duct and ending up in the nasal cavity, which loosens up the mucus and gives you a runny nose. So that's why you get a runny nose when you cry, because of that feature of the lacrimal bone. So I have class starting in a couple minutes, so I'm just going to go through some bony features on the side of the skull, and then I'll conclude this video and we will pick up where we left off in the next one. So of the temporal bone, this is the mastoid process. Mastoid means breast-like. This hole is the external acoustic meatus, and this little pointy guy is the styloid process of the temporal bone. So I'm stressing of the temporal bone because there are several other styloid processes in the skeleton. Styloid just means pen-like, so anything that looks kind of pen-ish has been called the styloid process. You've got them on your radius and ulna, for example, so styloid process of the temporal bone is what you would need to say to tell me that you not only know what the process is, but also what bone it's on. We've also got, I'm just going to outline it here. The squamous or squamosal, slash temporal suture. So this is one of those things that has a lot of names. You can say any of them, so squamous suture, squamosal suture, temporal suture, all of those are fine. The squamosal and squamous word is referring to the fact that that part of the temporal bone is extremely thin and flat, and it's almost razor-like. And squamous or squamosal means thin and flat and scale-like, so that's why it's called that. So that suture is named for that portion of the temporal bone. And then we can see a little bit the side view of the lambdoidal suture. That means it looks like the Greek character lambda, which is roughly like that. But there's a better view of it on the posterior aspect of the skull. So I'm going to conclude this since my lab is starting. But in the next video, we will flip this around and look at the back view, and we'll also look at the underside of the skull and look down into the brain pan and see what there is to see. So thank you for your attention, and I will just catch you in the next video.